Hello, and welcome back to Terri Reid's Attic, a place where we share stories of things that go bump in the night. Sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the stories. In this episode, I'd like to talk to you about the Stephenson County Historical Society's museum, the Taylor House. This is a little about the Taylor House from the Society's website. Oscar Taylor and Malvina Snow were married in 1842, and they made their first home in a cottage on Adams Street in Freeport. Oscar was admitted to the bar in 1850 and then opened a bank in 1851. In 1857, he hired the Chicago architectural firm of Boyington and Wheelock to design a home for his growing family. Wheelock also designed Freeport's Brewster House Hotel, where Abraham Lincoln stayed when in town for the Lincoln-Douglas debate. The Taylor home was built from locally quarried limestone with walls 2 feet thick. The property was originally 17 acres, but it's now only 3 acres. And the Taylors planted many of the trees and shrubs that remain today. The home was named Bohemiana, which reflected the free-spirited and artistic souls who lived there. The Taylors had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. Many famous people of the day visited the Taylors at Bohemiana. They include Horace Mann, Horace Greeley, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Edward Everett Hale, and even Jane Addams, who was originally from Cedarville, not too far away from Freeport. The house was opened as a museum in 1944. Today, the house is furnished to reflect the early years of the family. I was lucky enough not to only be on the board of directors for a number of years, I also was hired to be an interim museum director for a number of months. Here are a few of the stories I gathered from the Taylor House. Sitting in the midst of one of the oldest neighborhoods in Freeport, the Taylor House's lovely Victorian stone is surrounded by several acres of arboretum. As you drive up the winding driveway, you can see the stately 2-story mansion with its cupola on the roof, a watchtower for unrequited love. Looking at the sun sparkle off the windows in the cupola, you wouldn't think that such a place would be haunted. The subtle shift of a curtain in the front parlor couldn't be a specter gazing out to see who will be visiting the museum today, could it? The constant tread of footsteps in the attic couldn't be the busy work of otherworldly feet, certainly not. However, the Taylor House seems to have a group of caretakers who have been with the house for a long time. A very long time. My first encounter with a Taylor ghost was when I was serving as the interim director of the museum. The house was and still is a wonderful place. Dark, rich woodwork, leaded windows that catch the sun, and alcoves and shelves that hold hidden treasures and wonders. It was late winter. Snow had fallen on the grounds, and the sun sparkled through the windows. There was a peaceful quiet to the house. But perhaps some thought it was too quiet. One afternoon, as I sat in the director's office, meeting with another board member, we were both interrupted by the sudden sound of a grandfather's clock announcing the coming of the hour. The clear ringing echoed throughout the house, and we both smiled at how charming it sounded. Later that week, I met with our most knowledgeable volunteer and asked her which grandfather clock was the one that was working. She shook her head sadly and said that although the museum had invested in experts, no one had been able to repair the ancient workings of any of the clocks. So they all had stood quiet for many, many years. I told her that I had heard one, and she replied that was impossible. I rushed up to the director's office and called the board member who had been with me that day. I explained my conversation with the volunteer, and she assured me that indeed she had heard the clock too. Then I returned downstairs to the front hall. The volunteer had left for the night, and I stood staring at the grandfather's clock in that front hall, quite alone in the house. I was really hoping that the clock wouldn't start ringing again, because I'm really quite a coward. But rather than wait, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I took a deep breath and opened the casement that held the inner workings. I brushed away the dust and the cobwebs and looked at the weights and the chains that help synchronize the pendulum's movement and propel the hands of the clock. When you pull the chains, the weights are drawn up, and the drag of the weights going down causes the pendulum to swing back and forth. I pulled the chains slowly so the weights were as high as they could be, and then I gently pushed the pendulum. It clicked back and forth. Then I reached up to open the casement above the clock face. I moved the hands carefully, stopping at each half hour to allow the clock to chime. The pendulum was still moving rhythmically, and now the hands were moving on their own. I stood back and smiled and realized that if experts couldn't get this to happen, this certainly wasn't something that I had caused. Mr. Taylor, I said aloud, if you would like to keep this clock running and hear the chimes echo through the house again, let's just both agree to chalk it up to natural causes. For 6 years, the clock never missed a beat, and although the new directors were responsible for resetting the weights each week, I'm sure that Mr. Taylor kept an eye on the clock, just in case they forgot. Now that incident happened about 20 years ago. So let's fast forward to just a few years ago, when I was invited by a local paranormal investigation group to accompany them on a nighttime tour of the Taylor house. They gave me a K2 EMF reader and explained how it worked. We started on the second floor of the house and worked our way through the bedrooms and then the servants' quarters. We didn't get much activity there. Then we went to a large display room on the second floor that held a collection of antique toys as well as a number of dioramas that a local artist had created. The dioramas were housed on a platform with a number of steps, so depending on your height, you would be able to easily look through the viewing windows to the scenes portrayed. I sat down on the steps, and suddenly my K2 meter showed activity. I remember that just before he passed away, I had the chance to interview Mr. Blackwell, who was the artist who had created the dioramas. I asked aloud if it was him, and the K2 stayed up in the amber area for a few moments, and then, once again, there was no activity. Then we got a call from the other half of the group. They had gone through the first floor and the basement first, and now it was time to switch. Can I just admit here, I don't like basements. I really don't like basements. And the basement of the Taylor house, an old limestone foundation basement, really freaked me out. I don't know if it was because that's where we had always housed the military display. And often memorabilia from past wars carry a paranormal energy of their own. It also could be because of spirits of a far different circumstance were present, as there were rumors that the Taylor house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Whatever the reason, I was hesitant to go exploring that space in the dark. While the two groups conferred about their experiences, I walked over to the grandfather clock. The current director had moved the grandfather clock to a space just before the entrance to the basement. It was no longer working. I stood in front of the clock, trying to get up the nerve to go down those narrow, creepy steps to the basement, when suddenly my K2 meter went all the way up to red. "Mr. Taylor?" I asked. "Is that you?" It stayed up on red, making a little beeping sound. I assumed it was Mr. Taylor. I lowered my voice. "Mr. Taylor?" "They're going to make me go down to the basement," I confessed. "And I'm more than a little frightened about what might be down there. Would you mind accompanying me down there?" Okay, so my logic here was that if I had a ghost accompany me, then I really didn't have to worry about anything that I might encounter downstairs. It seemed like a logical option at the time. My K2 stayed up on the red during the entire time I was down in the basement. It finally went down to green once I'd come upstairs and thanked Mr. Taylor for his time. The paranormal group was amazed. I wasn't. Mr. Taylor was still the gentleman he'd been when he was alive. The Gilded Clock. In the front of the Taylor house, near the doorway to the dining room, there is a tall, mirrored table, upon which sits a French gilded clock. The clock is protected by a large glass dome that is somewhat unwieldy, so we tend to dust it off, but basically leave the clock alone. The story behind the clock is that a young woman from the East decided to move to the West. At the time, Illinois was the West. And because she didn't want her clock damaged during transit, she carried the clock on her lap for the entire stagecoach trip. The Historical Society brought in a fellow who specialized in cleaning clocks. He took the lovely French clock apart, cleaned it, and pronounced it in perfect working order. He told the executive director of the museum that if she wanted the clock to work, all she would have to do is wind the clock every morning. The director looked at the big, fragile glass dome and decided it would probably be better if she did not try to wind the clock, for fear the glass dome might break. So it was cleaned and put back on the table. Several weeks later, while working in the Taylor house, the director heard a ringing sound, like the sound you would hear from a bicycle bell. She walked around the house, trying to find out where the ringing was coming from, but would never find it before it stopped. Finally, one afternoon she was in the dining room and the ringing began. She turned and walked into the hallway. To her great amazement, the French gilded clock was ringing the hour. She leaned closer and could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock underneath the dome. She decided that this was just another gift from the Taylors to show their appreciation of the renovations that had been taking place in the drawing room. Perhaps a Taylor seal of approval. The sunroom. The sunroom in the Taylor house is a wonderful place, filled with plants and floor-to-ceiling windows. It was probably a place where many Taylor memories were made, and perhaps some Taylor pranks were played and are still being played. We had just finished an evening of Spirits of Yesteryear, the wonderful Stephenson County Historical Society's Halloween event. The mansion was dressed as if a member of the family had died, with the mourning trappings of the Victorian era. We also exhibited antique mortuary equipment, had a horse-drawn hearse circle the house. It would offer rides, not final ones, to any takers, and told ghost stories in the one-room schoolhouse. It was a delightful night that was sure to send a shiver up your spine and put a smile on your face. The board members and volunteers were closing up the house and the rest of the exhibits. The luminaries had been extinguished, the last of the apple cider sipped, and the horses packed up into their trailers. The new director had requested the help of my son David to close up the sunroom. David stood about a head taller than the director did. I stood nearby speaking with the director as David walked over to the double French doors that led into the sunroom. The sky was black. It was a moonless fall night, and the few stars that shone were hidden behind the large trees in the side yard. The dining room lighting was dimmed, and the rest of the grounds had been closed off for the night. It was the time when the Taylors could resume their hold on the house. David stepped up and closed the first door, securing the locks both on the top of the door into the molding and the bottom of the door into the floor. Then he moved over to close the second door. As he started to close the door was yanked from his hands and flung wide open. David jumped back, shocked. Actually, we all jumped. I could almost hear the Taylors giggling in the background. David approached the door for a second time, a little hesitantly, and then slowly closed it and hurriedly locked it. Our hearts all beat a little faster due to this unexpected Halloween trick from the Taylors. Before I included this story in my collection, I decided to see if the door thrusting open could have been one of those natural old house occurrences. I stood on the spot where David stood and reached up as David did. The door, in fact, did move forward as I placed my weight on the threshold of the sunroom. However, though I tried from many different angles, the door never opened with the force that we experienced that night. Raleigh salve. It's always comforting to have someone else experience some of the out-of-this-world happening at the Taylor house. Unfortunately for a former director, these happenings occurred with quite a bit of regularity. The first occurrence happened in the library. Many mornings as she opened the museum, she would be met with a very distinct but unfamiliar smell emanating from the library. She would walk around the room, sniffing, trying to locate the source of the scent, but it would elusively evade her. Months later, the director decided to sell some of the Raleigh products in the museum gift shop. The Raleighs are an important part of Freeport history, and in the old days, Raleigh salesmen used to travel from house to house in bright yellow horse-drawn wagons, selling their wares. She unpacked each item and placed it on display. When she opened a container of Raleigh salve, she immediately recognized the smell as the one that occurred occasionally in the library. After doing some research, she found that Malvina Taylor was ill in her later years, and one of her maladies was arthritis. Because the staircase would have been too much for Malvina to climb every day, the library had been refurbished to hold her bedroom. It stood to reason, the director surmised, that Malvina would have used that Raleigh's product to ease away the aches and pains of her old bones. Quite a living testimony to the lasting strength of Raleigh products, right? Or, maybe I shouldn't say living testimony. The fireplace. The Taylor house has a wonderful collection of old fireplaces, all charming and ornate, but unused. Well, at least they're unused by the living occupants of the house. Cold rain had just begun to beat down on the windshield as the director pulled in behind the museum. The wind had blown most of the leaves from the trees, and they lay in a sodden mass of yellow, gold, and brown on the driveway. She rushed to the house and let herself in. This would be a great day to have a warm fire, she said to herself as she hurried upstairs to the director's office. About halfway through the morning, the museum director noticed a terrifying scent in the air, wood burning. She rushed through the rooms to see if there was any visible smoke, and upon finding nothing, hurried down to the boiler room to see if the problem had begun there. But when she reached the boiler room, everything was fine. In fact, as she walked slowly through the house again, the only place she could smell the wood was in the parlor. She went outside to see if the scent of a neighbor's fireplace had carried to the house, but there was no such smell in the air. Finally, she went back into the parlor and was once again greeted by the cozy, warm smell of a burning fire from an empty, cold-to-the-touch fireplace. An hour later, the smell was gone. The director has enjoyed the scent of the cozy warm fire a couple more times since the first occurrence. I suppose that this ultimately means that on cold, rainy autumn days, everyone, even the dead, enjoys a nice crackling fire. The room under the stairs. I kind of want to add dun 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 to this, so I guess I just did. The room under the stairs sounds so much better than the bathroom. But indeed, it was in the bathroom on the first floor of the Taylor house where our next occurrence happened. The museum director had been giving an evening tour to a group of visitors. She had finished the museum part of the tour and had sent them on their way to meet her downtown so she could point out some Freeport historic sites of interest. She locked up the house and quickly went to use the bathroom before she left for the second part of the tour. She was using the facilities when suddenly the doorknob started to shake violently. The director immediately assumed that she had locked one of the tourists into the museum. She called out that she would be out in a moment and hurriedly finished. When she got out, the house was quiet. The doors were still all locked from the inside, and no one, at least no one living, was in the house. Ghostly urgings, perhaps? Thank you for listening to Terri Reid's Attic. If you enjoyed the stories, please consider becoming one of our supporters. Look for us on YouTube, as well as through your favorite podcast provider. If you have a question or comment, please email us at stories@terrireid.com. That's stories@terrireid.com. Until next time, let me leave you with an old Celtic prayer. From ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord, deliver us.